na avungu aratwara no mundu akahewe ikachika nona o kulia kwale kwa ngitunyu atwakiruwa nake ngitunyu ni akenengero.
My bitterest memory of the war is being given registration certificates while Europeans were given our land. A former army colleague, a European, got the best part of my land, and I was forced to carry a registration card. The pain of that treatment still lingers in my stomach. The bitterness still lasts, and it is the worst kind of bitterness. Then there was our pay, 4 shillings a month. 4 shillings a month for 30 good days. And some maize flour to eat when you've spent the day carrying a heavy load on your head. Those were very bitter times. And we were deceived that we were fighting for our land. But where is that land, even today? These are the reasons that we formed our political party, because of these injustices and exploitations. It was a most bitter thing to be moved from your home, like this one here, told to get out of the way while your house was destroyed by a tractor.
Starting around the turn of the century, Kenya was one of the last places in Africa to be colonized by the British. Like South Africa and Rhodesia, the British dreamt of creating not just another African colony, but a settler state for whites. Early stages of settlement were characterized by the burning of villages, murder, and the dispossession of Kikuyu, the largest ethnic group in Kenya, from their lands. Land dispossession would only intensify during the 7 decades of British rule as it encouraged the settlement of English people in the new settler colony. Its rule based on ongoing dispossession could only be maintained by ever-increasing repression, apartheid, and punitive measures. The Kikuyu were forced into economic dependency through arbitrary tax laws that ensured the continuous exploitation of African labor for settlers on stolen land.
Enacted a series of oppressive taxes to ensure they generate revenue. The hut tax, a tax paid to the British government for each family-owned hut, was introduced in 1902. This meant that Kenyans had to work for someone else in order to have money to pay for the tax. If they didn't pay, the punishment was forced labor. It was followed by the poll tax. Kenyans had to work 60 days a year for the government if they were not already employed by British settlers. By 1913, British settlers were given 999-year leases on stolen land and they needed labor for them. The Kenyans who lived on the land stolen by the British were deemed squatters and made up most of the agricultural labor on farms. Over the years, their tenancy rights were eliminated, and by 1939, settlers could demand 270 days of work from the squatters. These settlers even created identity discs for Kenyans to limit the movement of laborers. Many Kenyan workers were poorly treated by settlers, and flogging was commonly used to discipline them.
Naturally, this was met with much resistance. Any attempts at liberal reform calling for more African representation and ameliorating the worst excesses of injustice faced great political repression, imprisonment, and murder. Note that these were not even calls for independence, only reform and equal representation. In the 1950s, an underground political rebellion movement emerged to fight for independence and justice. In the name of self-defense, the British declared a state of emergency. The British unleashed a military campaign of unprecedented scale, subjecting the Kikuyu population to concentration camps, in which torture was an everyday occurrence. Historian Carolyn Elkins has called this Britain's Gulag system. The British thought they could squash the rebellion within 3 months, but it led to 7 years of full-blown war on and terrorization of the entire Kikuyu population. The British did not only increase their military presence in Kenya, the entire settler population became militarized. Women started to take up arms, settlers had a gun at hand during dinner, and the majority of an entire society wanted to see African blood flow. Carolyn Elkins describes this as an eliminationist mindset.
In the words of one former colonial district officer, he said this: "All we heard was how savage Mau Mau was, shoot to kill. You can't imagine how often I heard, the only good kook is a dead kook." Now, I would argue that this eliminationist discourse was predominant throughout the colony.
During the 8 years of rebellion, the freedom fighters killed 32 British settlers and around 1,100 Kenyan loyalists, that is, people who served the British and often profited from British imperialism at the expense of their own population. By contrast, Hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu were murdered by the British, and virtually everyone was at some point detained in the British concentration camps. How do you justify your position based on active dispossession and apartheid? How do you manufacture consent for apartheid and even genocide? How do you justify your own position based on theft and violence? And how, when you lust for the blood of the other, do you hold on to a belief about your own entitlement, righteousness, and moral superiority? The short answer is racism. To explore these questions, I will turn to the 1955 movie Simba, an American-British theatrical film made at the height of the rebellion and the British concentration camps. This is a case study in imperial propaganda, its tricks and frames to make the imperial violence seem necessary, even when the more progressive voices call it regrettable. Imperial propaganda turns the victims of imperialism into perpetrators and the imperialists victims, as harbors of progress, civilization, and humanism, now forced to defend themselves against the barbarians. It turns apartheid and genocide into self-defense. It relies on the dehumanization of the people that they oppress and murder. The violence of the freedom fighters, grossly exaggerated, are made to be the origin and cause of racism and hatred. The dehumanization works by depoliticizing their struggle and making it an expression of some inherently backward and violent culture. The colonizers represent the opposite, the dreams of humanity and progress, which is undermined by the barbarians or savages who are driven by hatred, superstition, and fanaticism. This all sounds all too familiar, of course, as I am making this in the context of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide in Palestine perpetrated by the Zionist settler colony, in which the majority of the settler society indulges in the destruction of Palestinians. This case study in British imperial propaganda is thus directly read in today's context, exploring some similarities in the historical conditions of a recent settler society, its genocidal consequences, and the propaganda to justify and sustain systems of ongoing dispossession, apartheid, and genocide. This essay examines imperial propaganda to understand how white supremacy and racism serve as an ideology to justify and erase the subjection and even destruction of an entire population. My argument is as follows. Even when imperial propaganda purports to be above and in contrast to the genocidal frenzy of settlers, it in fact contributes to the dehumanization of the indigenous inhabitants. It not only fails to counter the genocidal mindset and practice, but it partakes in it, structures it, and ultimately justifies it. Before turning to the 1955 movie Simba, we first need to set the scene.
In Nairobi, capital of Kenya, Europeans and Africans still walk the streets in fear of the dreaded Mau Mau. For it is that band of fanatics whose bloody deeds have cast a dark shadow across the face of Kenya. Some are brought in to face justice, others are shot in fights with police and troops, but thousands more escape to continue their crusade of murder and violence. There is little reliable information about the setup of the terrorist organization, for few members even know from whom they take their orders. They obey blindly, savagely attacking the defenseless, burning, looting, murdering. Kenya is the battlefield of a conflict that cannot end until the Mau Mau is dissolved forever.
The Wikipedia entry on this topic is called the Mau Mau Rebellion. This is a typical example of the victor writing history. The name Mau Mau does not mean anything in any language. It was a British invention that made it sound tribal and savage rather than the political organization that it was.
Mau Mau never existed.
It became the name to signify everything beyond the pale of the human, something so terrifying that one cannot reason with it. These terrifying monsters, not humans, must be murdered and incarcerated, and later put through British rehabilitation camps with shock therapy to bring them back into humanity.
Dehumanizing discourse about Mau Mau that was startling. Mau Mau, and I quote from various sources from the time, were filthy animals, vermin, scum, barbarians, atavistic pigs, cunning, bloodthirsty, and the logic, as with the logic of any looming genocide, is all too easy to follow. Mau Mau adherents did not belong to the human race. They were diseased, filthy animals who could infect the rest of the colony. Their very presence threatened to destroy Kenya. They had to be eliminated.
The name Mau Mau became a shorthand representing everything evil and scary in Africa, legitimating a state of emergency that gives the settler state and the settlers free rein to unleash unlimited violence on these subhumans. It thus functions in the same way as Hamas is portrayed in Western media, as something so inhuman and evil that makes everything permissible to squash it. In both cases, the dehumanization works through depoliticization. These are not political organizations that respond to decades of injustice, apartheid, and dispossession in an organized way to achieve their political goals. They are absolute monsters defined by their cultural backwardness, savage tribalism, or barbaric religion that places them beyond anything recognizably human. The name Mau Mau was part of a propaganda war that was waged. Propaganda is always an important battleground for imperial and anti-imperial forces. On the ground, Kikuyu rebels used popular songs to raise political consciousness, a form of guerrilla propaganda. The official media outlets, of course, spoke the imperial language. It's in this context of the propaganda war that this movie must be understood, as it was made at the height of the war on the Kikuyu, part of a media industry of news, documentaries, and theater film, a concerted effort to represent the political rebellion in Kenya as ruthless savagery, undermining the important work of good and innocent settlers. Let's start with the poster. A terrifying African tribal boogeyman is ready to attack, followed by hordes of Africans. A male British hero fights back and protects an English lady. It promises an exciting and exotic adventure romance, which will also teach you something about what goes on in Africa today. The sensationalist headlines conjure fantasies of African terror and savagery. They even manage to present the romance story in a racist way. Their love defied primitive jungle laws, whatever that means. The movie begins with the murder of a settler. The settler's brother, Alan Howard, not yet knowing what happened, comes to Kenya with the plan of joining his family to permanently settle in Kenya. He meets Mary Crawford, a young nurse who was born in Kenya.
I was born here. Africa's my home.
These two characters show the British dream of Kenya as a settler colony, attracting English people to settle and build a future there, and a new generation of young people who fully belong to the colony, who consider it native British soil. Alan is shocked to learn about the murder of his brother. He expresses his first moment of grief and shock in the most imperial, paternalistic, and supremacist way possible.
But he liked them. He was good to them.
Yes.
I know it's no consolation, but he shot 3 of them before they killed him.
How unjust that this poor, kind settler who treated, quote-unquote, his natives well, was so brutally murdered. Ungrateful savages. This sets up the drama of Alan's character.
Of what I was feeling.
You're beginning to hate the Africans, aren't you?
Despite his good intentions to settle in Kenya and bring progress to, quote-unquote, the Africans, he is consumed by hatred of Africans because of what they had done to his brother, who is presented as a martyr and victim of British goodness. The movie thus traces the cause of racism and the settlers' desire to see African blood flow squarely to the political rebellion, something that is portrayed as backward African savagery that the British imperial presence seeks to emancipate Africans from. Everyone is shocked by the murder of the good settler, and families have heated discussions about whether all Africans are dangerous savage children or only the so-called Mau Mau.
Why was he killed?
Why doesn't apply to the African any more than it does to a backward child. They both of them act entirely on instinct.
Oh, nonsense. Mary. Well, it is nonsense. Mama want to drive us out of this country, don't they?
That's the idea, I believe.
That's why they killed David. Because he was kind. Because the Africans liked him. It isn't part of a Mama plan for white men to be liked.
Well, you're entitled to your own opinions, my dear, but I'll stick to mine.
It's true. If every European behaved as he did, there'd be no discontented African. And Mama wouldn't be able to exist at all.
Nurse Mary Crawford is part of a progressive, quote-unquote, minority who believes in the coexistence of black and white in Kenya. Her African counterpart is her colleague Dr. Karanja. They represent the hope for a Kenyan future, helping the African masses portrayed as ignorant and backward. Because these masses are like children, they can either have the good parental influence by white settlers and British-educated Africans like Dr. Karanja, or the bad influence, the tribal leaders who use fear and superstition to manipulate them. We witness an initiation ritual of the Mau Mau, where we see the shocking rituals never seen before promised on the poster.
Oh, hell no!
Importantly, it shows how the Mau Mau coerced the Kikuyu to take the oath, thus showing that they are not taking up arms out of their own motivation, but are oppressed by their African leaders. The threat of the Mau Mau increases. All the settlers are extremely uneasy. Are they able to trust their servants? Who is kind and docile, and who is, in secret, part of the terrifying Mau Mau? We hear more discussions among settlers where the majority lusts for African blood.
Burn down their huts! Show them we mean business!
This is countered by the progressive voice, the doctor, like Mary Crawford, the nurse, who believes in black-white unity.
Mau Mau must be stomped out, yes, but we've got to think of the future.
The threat of the Mau Mau increases. The murdered settler's brother is threatened and attacked by a servant. Later, the racist settler family with their trophies of death in their home are murdered. We get casual images of the concentration camps of the British as if it is a natural reaction and self-defense, and not even worthy of discussion. They casually show how easily they murder Africans. There is something even more uncanny about this casual representation of concentration camps and gratuitous murder. Recall that this movie is made during the state of emergency. Many of the extras used were in fact prisoners, some of them executed 3 days later.
If you still think they're human beings, go in there and have a look!
Despite his overt racism, Alan is shown as a kind settler who takes care of African children.
Do you feed him? Sometimes. Well, feed him all the time.
Thus representing the benign parental presence needed for the future of Africans. Mary and Alan fall in love in an unsexy 1950s submission-domination style. We learn that the leader of the Mau Mau goes by the name of Simba. The good Dr. Karanja steps to the authorities because he realizes who Simba is.
Is my father.
The movie builds to a climax as the savage tribal leader Simba schemes to murder Alan. Alan, Mary, and Karanja try to hold the Mau Mau at bay. Karanja tries to reason with them. His father disowns him and tries to kill him. Alan shoots Simba and Karanja is murdered by an angry crowd. In his dying moments, he does not really care about the fact that his father tried to murder him or that Alan murdered his father, but he reflects on the sins and backwardness of his own people.
Perhaps we don't deserve peace.
Pointing to the African child, he believes in the innocence and possibility of progress for future Africa. The African child can still be saved and emancipated from African backwardness. On that racist, optimistic note, the movie ends. This is the plot in a nutshell. For the analysis, I want to dissect a few scenes. The discussions of Africans as children, the discussions of the settlers about what to do, the portrayal of the Mau Mau oath as a savage tribal primitive ritual, and the struggle for the soul of Kenya as a generational battle between father and son.
They're nothing more or less than backward children.
All settlers refer to Africans as children who must be guided into the proper direction and are at risk of being manipulated by the wrong influences.
60 years ago, when the first white men came here, these Africans were hardly down from the trees. How can they be rational, adult human beings? No, they're children. No, the trouble is we've given the Africans the wrong sort of toys. Ideas of self-government, nationalism. Now the Mau Mau have got hold of them and they've become dangerous. Damn dangerous.
This racist developmental logic, distinguishing between the mature civilized and the immature savage, is shared by everyone on the political spectrum. We can distinguish between the liberal version of this maturity-trope and a fascist one, understanding the two as a dialectic mutually enforcing each other and not as an antagonistic opposition. In the liberal version, the colonizer comes as a good parent, taking loving care of the natives as if they were his own children.
But he liked them. He was good to them.
After all we've done for the Africans. If every European behaved as he did, there'd be no discontented African.
If only the ignorant natives could appreciate this fact, then a beautiful future of black and white living in harmony would be possible. In the fascist version, these backward children are a bunch of savages that must be controlled or murdered.
These Mau Mau were like animals. They lived in the bush, they had long hair, some of them had game skins, coats around them. They ran on, carried a gun in one hand, and they ran like baboons through the bush. Like this, and I shot and missed him. Then I put the gun up and got him too. Then there was another one running a short way. When I put a bullet, it turned out to be a young girl of 16.
The fascist considers himself a victim of his own goodness by giving them ideas of progress and democracy, i.e., naive liberalism is countered by a tough, grounded realism. In another video, I discuss the trope of justifying racism by pretending that racialized others are like children who need paternal guidance and, when necessary, strict discipline. This is to the benefit of the backward children themselves and society as a whole. In the slavery system in the United States, this was presented as an eternal, harmonious, God-given order. British imperialism at times promised the maturation of the backward savage at some undefined moment in the future. But this state of maturity could only be brought about under the tutelage of the British Empire.
The people here in Kenya, the masses of the Africans here in Kenya, are probably roughly about the same stage Great Britain was 500 years ago. We do not think that normal forms of democracy are suitable.
Historian Caroline Elkins traced the transformation of the British colonial discourses from the 19th to the 20th centuries. Once the Africans are children, that's why colonialism is good narrative became a little bit too uncomfortable, colonial discourse changed the language. Now there are no longer civilized parents and savage children, but senior partners and junior partners who work together to bring progress and development to a backward Africa. This progressive version of the same racist developmentalism is embodied in the character of Dr. Karanja. He represents the progressive African, capable of emancipating himself from the backwardness of his culture and his forefathers. He represents the hope for a collaboration of white and black for the development of Kenya. When he meets the white doctor, the ideal harmonious relation of the senior partner and the junior partner is evident.
Yes, doctor, of course. My people are simple and they have their grievances, we know that.
You may be an African doctor, but make no mistake about your place with regard to the whites who, out of their kindness, gave you all these opportunities. As mentioned before, even the name Mau Mau is a British invention and part of the propaganda war. The aim was to portray the uprising not as a political organization fighting for independence, but as a manifestation of African tribal savagery, full of scary tribal rituals.
Today, if you mention the word Mau Mau, particularly if I'm in Britain, to anybody for that matter there, but if in the US, talking to people who lived through this period, they almost universally recoil. Oh, horrible, savage, most horrible, bestial thing that's ever happened. Now, in some ways, this is a testament to the success of the British colonial government's ability to manipulate information coming out of Kenya. There was a powerful public relations machine that was absolutely masterful. And I think if you respect the British for anything, it's their ability to manipulate and spin information.
One thing that recurs in British propaganda is the oath or initiation ceremony into the so-called Mau Mau rebellion.
The power of Mau Mau begins with the oath of initiation, cunningly devised to prey upon the childlike fears of simple, uneducated people, long steeped in a primitive dread of death. No one knows the true origin and meaning of the words Mau Mau, But the initiation ritual is a distorted version of old tribal ceremonies.
This is portrayed by the British as a process of dehumanization. They are cast under some spell where they lose their humanity and become inhuman agents of Mau Mau evil.
Some behind wire are fanatics, men who have taken degrading and beastly oaths, which put them beyond the pale of human society.
We used an oath to help people understand what the struggle was about. Many people were cowards. They were frightened of politics. They said it was bad for us to set ourselves against the Europeans. We decided to put courage into them, and to do this, we had to give them an oath and tell them, we want you to be ready to die fighting for this land, fighting the white man until he stops ruling us, until the land he has stolen comes back to us. Then we shall have our freedom and not be ruled badly by the colonial government.
They believed that the oath which the Kikuyu took turned them into people who were no longer really human, but were animals. And in order to persuade them that they were no longer animals, they would have to be rehabilitated.
Others, only tainted with subversive doctrines, are being shown the error of their ways and are slowly being rehabilitated.
Mr. Breckenridge, what do you see as the main aim of your rehabilitation work?
The main aim is to try and bring these rather fanatical people back to normal life, to clear the Mau Mau out of their system and bring them back to normal, decent, civilized people again.
The concentration camps thus featured so-called rehabilitation camps to cleanse the inner Mau Mau, to bring back the Kikuyu to inside the fold of humanity. These so-called rehabilitation camps were not only brainwashing camps, but torture camps.
In Marira Works Camp, we were taken from our cages early in the morning and spent the whole day under beating torture, forced to sing ridiculous songs. Detainees there looked mad, like those taken to Mathari Mental Hospital. It was so atrocious at Marira that 2 people were beaten to death during the time I was there. But what made it even worse was that the warders went on beating the bodies even after they were dead. Not only was this inhuman, it showed the whole stupidity of the rehabilitation orgy. We were treated in ways that no man would dare to treat an animal.
The fantasies of savage African cruel rituals tantalizes the Western viewer. Here it further functions to show how the Mau Mau intimidate and coerce the Kikuyu population. Just as Imperial media portrays Palestinians in Gaza as oppressed by Hamas, thereby delegitimizing Hamas as a political actor, the Kikuyu are portrayed at the mercy of the Mau Mau. The Mau Mau use violence, intimidation techniques, ritual and superstition to brainwash and manipulate the population into becoming anti-British. It is not decades of dispossession of land, exploitation of labor, public flogging, control over movement, and mass incarceration and torture that lead the Kikuyu to fight for their independence, but it is the fault of evil African tribal leaders who stir up the masses against the British. Through the African tribal leaders, Africans act against their self-interest, refusing the great British imperial gift of civilization. This is an old trope that we already find in the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He argues that Africa does not belong to world history. Africa minus North Africa, because that does not belong to Africa proper because racism. This idea that Africa is somehow outside of world history and needs European guidance continues to resonate today, as every single French president has made clear.
Le drame de l'Afrique, c'est que l'homme africain n'est pas assez entré dans l'histoire.
Je crois qu'on a oublié de nous dire merci. C'est pas grave, ça viendra avec le temps. L'ingratitude, je suis bien placé pour le savoir, c'est une maladie non transmissible à l'homme.
In his argument, he defends Europeans' enslavement of Africans. Hegel is an Enlightenment philosopher who believes that freedom is the essence of humanity, yet he justifies enslavement of Africans because, left to their own devices, Africans would remain stuck in an even worse situation. Because of superstition and tyranny, Africans left to themselves would live in a situation of slavery worse than their actual enslavement. Hegel thus argues that European enslavement of Africans helps to humanize Africans, thus bringing them closer to freedom. There is a disturbing continuity between Hegel's arguments, British propaganda in the 1950s, and Hasbara today. Indigenous people are portrayed as living under fear and tyranny in their own communities. Enslavement, colonization, even genocide is all done in the name of saving indigenous people from themselves. Without settlers, colonizers, or enslavers, they would be worse off and would continue to live their miserable, barbarous, unfree lives in fear. Enslavement, mass incarceration, torture, genocide, apartheid, it is all meant to save and humanize the people whose lives they are in fact destroying.
No, I know you can't reason with the Mau, but you can with the Africans.
Burn down their huts. Show them we mean business.
Mau must be stamped out, yes, but we've got to think of the future. We must learn to live together, side by side, black and white, and make it a better world. There's no other way out of it.
I don't agree. I'm sorry, Doctor, but my husband and I have always done everything we could to help the Africans. We've cared for our own boys as if they were children. But you almost make us out to be heartless, cruel monsters, and it just isn't true. When we came out here after the First War, there was nothing here, nothing at all. We had to start at the very beginning. We've worked hard to build up our farm, and we've never even once been home to England for a holiday. We couldn't afford it. But we have looked forward to a few years' peace at the end of it all, instead of this horrible nightmare.
The scene where the settlers discuss what is to be done is an insightful illustration of the two faces of imperial supremacy. On the one hand, there is what I called a fascist mindset that sees that everything is justified to suppress indigenous people. Then there is the liberal imperial voice that is supposed to counter this genocidal frenzy. Here, this quote-unquote progressive voice is embodied by the local doctor. This will be the most progressive voice in the movie, shared by the nurse Mary Crawford and Dr. Karanja. Note how even the most progressive case still relies on the full dehumanization of the Mau. The only question is whether the rest of society is innocent and needs saving by the settlers, and if so, how.
I know you can't reason with the Mau, but you can with the Africans.
On the ground, this distinction means nothing. Both positions legitimize colonial crimes by appealing to self-defense. Both positions agree that the enemy is beyond the pale of humanity and must be viciously attacked and stamped out. How does one do that in a situation of guerrilla warfare? By controlling and targeting everyone in the society. This was true then, and it is true now.
There is nothing in the colonial record to suggest that there was Kenya's version or Britain's version of an Adolf Hitler. But it's my argument that these two intentions, maintaining colonial rule and preventing a massacre of the Kikuyu oath takers, the Mau supporters, were mutually exclusive in principle and nearly impossible to uphold under the realities and constraints of late colonial Kenya. And what we see happening is that from the very start, the British colonial government, Baring and the colonial secretary, are forced to create an incredibly restrictive police state. By 1953, they had introduced dozens of emergency regulations, laws ranging from enforcing communal punishment and curfews to individual mass movements of people, confiscation of property, imposition of special taxes, suspension of due process, detention without trial. The list goes on and on and on. But this doesn't work. And if you think about it quite logically, the only option that they had at this point was to do one of two things: pull out or round up the entire Kikuyu population, detain them, and force them somehow to submit to colonial authority.
The entire Kikuyu population was uprooted and herded into protected villages with home guards and watchtowers.
The distinction between the part and the whole, between Mau or Hamas and the Kikuyu or Palestinians, is non-performative, or in other words, it does not do what it says it does. Neither the Kikuyu nor the Palestinians are served by this distinction. The only people it serves are the imperial liberals themselves, who can believe in their own non-racism and goodness, while at the same time contributing to a climate that makes everything permissible against the political enemy. All the while, this dialectic between liberal and fascist imperialism justifies the state of emergency and the collective punishment of entire populations. Although the movie tries to argue for the liberal racist version, it is shockingly sympathetic to the genocidal settlers. They are portrayed as innocent settlers who fell victim to their own goodness. Part of this is the myth of the settler as bringing prosperity and giving opportunities to the natives, erasing the violence of early settlement and their own reliance on local knowledge and labor.
When we came out here after the First War, there was nothing here, nothing at all. We had to start at the very beginning. We worked hard to build up our farm.
British settlers arrived and explored land they thought belonged to no one. They soon settled down to farm and raise cattle. To clear title to the land, they negotiated with the Kikuyus. Here arose the misunderstanding that has plagued both Kikuyu and settler to this day. Neither side spoke the other's language. The white men sealed bargains they considered as final. It was many years before either side was aware of the error. For the whites, they were years of hard pioneering, improving the land. Lacking workers trained in his methods of farming, the settlers soon developed a squatter system to attract Kikuyu labor. The Kikuyus were offered enough land to build huts, grow crops, and pasture goats and cattle. In return, they worked on settlers' farms for 8 months of the year.
In the first 10 years of British involvement in Kenya, more than a third of the colony's budget went into military operations. By 1915, every major tribe had faced at least one so-called punitive expedition. This was the foundation on which 70 years of colonial rule were based. From the diaries of Francis Hall, February 1899. We proceeded to march quietly through the country, sending columns out to burn the villages and collect goats. We destroyed a tremendous number of villages, from the diaries of Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen, King's African Rifles. 8th September 1902. I have performed a most unpleasant duty today. I made a night march to the village where the white settler had been so brutally murdered the day before yesterday. I gave orders that every living thing, except children, should be killed without mercy. Every soul was either shot or bayoneted. We burned all the huts and razed the banana plantations to the ground. May 1905. Sotik. 92 killed, 2,000 cattle, 3,000 sheep and goats captured, 14,000 rounds rifle ammunition used, and 2 Maxim guns. September 1905. Kisi. 100 killed, 3,000 cattle captured. January 1906. Nandi. 1,100 killed, 16,000 cattle, 36,000 sheep and goats captured.
At the turn of the 20th century, the British colonial government decided that the basis of the political economy in Kenya was going to be on settler production. And this was made possible through the concerted policy of land alienation. In other words, through shaky alliances and treaties, land was going to be given outright to the white settlers. The colonial government is exceedingly interventionist. The settlers are miserable farmers when they show up on the scene. Many of them have very little experience. And the one factor that they could consistently squeeze in the economic equation once land was alienated was the labor factor. And if you look at where the Kikuyu live, they are living in very close proximity to the European estates, which means they are going to be the chief labor source on these European tea and coffee plantations.
My husband and I have always done everything we could to help the Africans.
He's my father.
The situation of Kenya is symbolically portrayed as a father-son conflict. The father represents the old order, a tribal Africa steeped in tyranny and superstition. The son represents the new order, educated by the British, wishing to emancipate the backward Africans from their condition. The good African is the one who turns against his father and traditions and imitates the imperialists. Dr. Karanja is so invested in white settler society that he will ignore that everyone is racist towards him.
No.
Don't be frightened, darling. It's only Dr. Karanja.
But I don't want him to touch me.
He will betray his father and give his life to serve a British Kenya. Through this father-son theme, the imperial notion of civilization and progress is portrayed. Will Kenya have a future of development and civilization under the tutelage of the British, or will it remain stuck in the natural state of tyranny and superstition under tribal leadership? Imperial propaganda always shows itself as bringing the boons of civilizations, hospitals, roads, and schools, hiding in plain sight the carceral caste society of genocide, dispossession, and exploitation that it sets up. In this framing of backward versus progressive forces, the underlying premise remains the same. The masses of Africans are a bunch of children that need to be guided in the proper direction and steered away from their traditions that keep them backward and stuck in their own oppression. The good progressive African is contrasted with the ignorant African masses, who must be guided and helped by the whites and the few colonially educated natives. British imperialism has always had trouble reconciling two fundamentally irreconcilable positions. The idea that women under imperial civilization have reached freedom and equality on the one hand, and the idea of women as naturally inferior and subordinate on the other. Mary Crawford represents this tension. On the one hand as equal, yet the position as nurse as opposed to doctor is a natural given, as is her submission to a man. In the Imperial project, feminism has always been used as a weapon of propaganda, portraying the colonized as oppressive to women and the colonizer as somehow bringing progress, even when their entire society and ideas of human nature are patriarchal to the bone. This white saving brown women from brown men trope has been variously labeled as imperial feminism, colonial feminism, or missionary feminism. In the movie, this is done by a simple reference to African men buying multiple wives trope, implying that women in African societies are like cattle.
He
says also that his wife has the tongue of a serpent and that she has borne him no men children. With the 20 pounds, he'll buy himself a new wife.
One contradiction is that in times of revolution, women are extremely important and active members of the resistance and persecuted as such. At the level of representation, this remains hard to integrate into the imperial propaganda narratives, and in the movie, this is simply ignored. It thus relies on a deeply patriarchal representation where all political actors are male, whilst a single line invoking an African women are oppressed trope is enough to establish British superiority with regard to gender. This is a story of a 20th century settler colony based on white supremacy and ongoing dispossession, with increasing levels of apartheid and punitive measures necessary to maintain the settlers' presence. The completely illegitimate basis of settler presence meets with increasing resistance. The settlers' justification for their own position occurs through a militarization of the entire society, fueled by an eliminationist or genocidal mindset, sharing a broad consensus that everything is permitted to crush the enemy. In order to maintain one's good conscience, this enemy must be completely dehumanized. It relies on a heavy propaganda war to turn perpetrators into victims, and to turn victims and political freedom fighters into evil monsters. Imperial propaganda relies on liberal notions of supremacy, arguing that perpetrators are superior and are bringing something positive to the region. They become victims of hostile, barbaric, or savage forces that are driven by their own barbarism and their hatred for the innocent, benign, superior colonizers. The perpetrator thus becomes the victim who, in self-defense, has to take strong measures. It even portrays this as a sacrificial civilizing mission that will save the natives from themselves. This anatomy of British imperial propaganda shows some recurring features of how racist propaganda works. Here are some of the features discussed. It depoliticizes the struggle and makes reference to some inherent cultural flaw, barbaric religion or tribal superstition. Part of the depoliticization is dehistoricization. The history prior to the rebellion is painted as if there was no conflict. The settler society projects an innocent past onto their crimes, which is then suddenly violently disturbed by the enemy agitator. Dehumanization. The enemy is not a political adversary but represents the ultimate evil beyond the pale of humanity. Everything is permitted to stop this inhuman evil. The whole and the part. This distinction between the whole and the part is conjured up to pretend that there is no broad support for the resistance. This is the purpose of the Free Gaza from Hamas hasbara. Palestinians are portrayed as victims of Hamas, just as Kikuyu are portrayed as coerced and manipulated by the Mau Mau. Of course, there is political diversity and strong disagreements and undoubtedly misuse of power, but on one thing everyone agrees. There is a collective will and determination to independence and liberation. Importantly, on the ground, this distinction does not matter. In other words, the distinction is not performative. It does not do what it says it does. Just like the British incarcerated every Kikuyu, the Zionist colony in Palestine indiscriminately murders and destroys everyone. There is, of course, one major difference between British Kenya and the Zionist colony in Palestine. The British were the biggest empire in the world, subjecting the world to their white supremacist project based on genocide and exploitation. The Zionist colony in Palestine emerged in the wake of the persecution and genocide of Jews in Europe. Following David Graeber, I do not think that migration itself is a crime and that people only belong to the soil that they were born on. This is part of the histories of pluralism that belong to every plot of land, and especially Palestine. But if your political project is based on the ethnic cleansing and ongoing dispossession of the inhabitants of the land to claim ownership and privileged rights, then one loses all political and moral legitimacy. The appeal to have one's own country after the Shoah is understandable. European countries remained hostile towards Jews after the war, enforcing a culture of silence and assimilation. After the war, there was no reckoning with the genocide, but most European countries were complicit in the continuation of the unhoming of Jews in Europe and making it impossible to have Jewish identity and culture within European countries. European countries were happy to export the Jewish problems elsewhere, with British imperialism having set the vision, agenda, and infrastructure for colonialism in Palestine. Before World War II, Zionism was popular among many British politicians precisely because of their own anti-Semitism. Moving from the internal other and enemy of Christian Europe to an imperial nation like the Euro-American hegemon, the humanization of Jews on Western imperial terms relies on the dehumanization of others. As Ariella Aisha Azoulay writes, the Allies exceptionalized Nazi crimes and construed them as unprecedented, thus absolving themselves of their colonial violence. This omission of the Allies' genocidal violence before and after World War II silenced the suffering and the claims of the different groups targeted by that genocidal violence. This double exceptionalization of the Nazis and of the European Jews was instrumental in the imposition of a new world order. Each of these made the real problem, Europe and its racializing and colonizing technologies, disappear. From the standpoint of its victims, to use Edward Said's brilliant phrase, this distinction does not matter. The prehistory does not matter if one is expelled from one's home, forced into exile, dispossessed from one's land and home, repressed by an apartheid regime, under constant surveillance, with slow death as the long-term strategy, with the always imminent threat of rapid genocide and ethnic cleansing that is now occurring. But it does mean that it is high time for European countries to start interpreting their historical responsibility in a different way than political and military support for genocide.